You ever straddle a fence? There are fences that you can straddle, and then there are fences that are very painful to straddle. You're building a fence on the border. Got barbed wire on the top. That'd be painful to straddle. It's painful to straddle a fence no matter what, really, when you stop and think about it. Not necessarily in the action of straddling it, but the consequences are very painful. Got 3 examples up here of fence straddlers. When Elijah talked to those people, we get the idea that the children of Israel had just thrown God away completely. That's not really the case. They always held Jehovah as a backup, or maybe even some of them as their main God. But they had these other contingency gods that they called upon. When you read the story of David, the people of Israel were sometimes fearless, sometimes fearful. Sometimes they just couldn't get off the fence to do what needed to be done. I'm amazed with the story of David, how this boy comes up and he shames the entire nation of Israel because they can't decide whether they're going to serve God or run from their enemies. Then the Apostle Paul, dealing with King Agrippa. This is the last of the Agrippas. This is the end of that family dynasty. This is the last of the Edomites. And if you read the prophet Obadiah, you understand that they are coming to an end, and it's prophesied that there will be no more of them, period. They cease to exist. Agrippa's the last of that line. When you understand how Agrippa was straddling the fence between Rome and serving God, believing in everything that he had been raised to believe in, the system that had been nurturing him from the time he was born, you realize that he couldn't make up his mind. And when Paul said, "Do you believe what I'm saying? Do you understand? I know you know what I'm saying is true." And Agrippa says, "Do you think in such a short time I can be persuaded to be a Christian?" I see these examples. I see these examples of people straddling the fence that can't make up their mind what they're going to do. And it must be totally frustrating to the Lord to see us wavering back and forth. And I get aggravated at that. But I catch myself doing the same thing in certain ways. It just is not manly to not be able to stand up and do what you know is right. It's not human character, made in the image of God, to not be able to make a decision and stand by it, to do what we decide we're going to do. You look at world events, and right now I'm seeing something that I'm just going to share this with you because it might not be true, but it's how I see it anyway. You look at the nations that are dealing with America right now. The Chinese, for instance. The Chinese have a view of the world that spans not years, not months, not years, not even decades. But the Chinese view of world events is long term. They have an idea that they look at us and they see this impetuous giving up, kind of can't make up our mind what we're going to do. We change our minds every few years and we do totally the opposite that we did before. All they need to do is wait. They're not straddling the fence. They've decided what side of the fence they're on. They're going to wait. And we're going to change because we can't make up our minds. And we can't do anything because we can't make up our minds. We straddle the fence. Do you realize how many of us do that spiritually? How many of us can't make up our minds? We can't decide what kind of people we ought to be. When Peter writes in 2 Peter chapter 3, he says, since we see all these things are to be destroyed, what sort of people ought we to be? We ought to understand we need to make up our minds what kind of people we're going to be. I read about other instances where the Lord understands that principle. And He called upon people who could make up their minds. I read the story of David, and I love reading that and looking at the reaction of David's brothers to David showing up at the battlefield. Eliab, his oldest brother, gets angry because David comes to ask how the battle is going. He says, I know your insolence, you little pipsqueak. You've come out here just to watch us fight and die. I'm adding a little bit there, but basically I think that's what he was saying. David said, what did I do now? How did I just asked a question. I asked the question, why is this uncircumcised Philistine taunting the armies of the living God? And you're getting mad at me. Make up your mind, boys. You want to fight for the Lord, or do you want to run from this Philistine? Well, I can kind of understand running from Goliath. He was 9'6", probably weighed somewhere close to 500 pounds. He had 125 pounds of armor that he wore, not including the greaves on his shins and the helmet on his head. The head of his spear weighed 6.5 pounds. I had hammers that I had to use all day long that just drove me crazy, because you try lifting and using a hammer that weighs 6 or 7 pounds all day long. You'll feel it at the end of the day, I'm telling you. This was a mighty man. Not to mention the fact that he had 6 fingers and 6 toes. That'd scare anybody. It scared the men of Israel. They couldn't make up their mind whether they trusted God or they wanted to run. Vacillating back and forth, back and forth. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And here comes a boy. A boy. And he comes to his brothers, and his brothers ridicule him. Get back there and take care of those sheep, you little character. And David goes to King Saul. He says, why are we letting this happen? I'll go out there and fight him. David jumped off the fence and said, I'll go. Now, Saul gives him his armor to a boy. Saul's taller and bigger than anybody else in Israel. It says he's head and shoulders above everybody else. And he, this big, strong man, king of Israel, gives his armor to a boy. What kind of leadership is that? What kind of king is that? What kind of indecisive man is that who pledged to be the king of Israel and serve the God of heaven? So he lets a shepherd boy go do his job, which David was more than happy to do. David says, hey, I'm not worried about this Philistine. If God be for me, who can be against me? He said, I was out there in the field when a lion came and grabbed one of the sheep. And I jumped on him and I grabbed him by his beard and I smote him and slew him. That means he hit him and he killed him. And when a bear came, I did the same thing. I don't know if you've ever seen an angry bear, but I don't want to do that. But David had the fear of God, not the fear of a bear. David had his trust in the Almighty, not in worrying about what a bear was going to do to him, because he saw that God had put him in that position. If God be for me, this furry creature is not going to be against me. I admire that. I envy that. I want to be that. But I have trouble sometimes with the most insignificant of things, wavering when I should be making a decision, standing when I shouldn't be sitting. And then we have another character. It's not that he straddled the fence. This man, I don't think, ever straddled a fence, ever. He was so much against God that God wanted him on his side. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being so on the opposite side that God says, I want that man? Saul of Tarsus. Wow. What a trooper. 100%. When they chose someone to be the witness, the official witness of the Sanhedrin, this bunch of, they weren't fence sitters. I don't know how to describe the Sanhedrin. Well, some of them were. Some of them were fence straddlers. Remember Nicodemus? Nicodemus. The same Nicodemus that came to Jesus in John chapter 3, snuck in there by night because somebody might see me. Snuck in there and said, Jesus, Lord, we know that you come from God as a teacher, because nobody could do what you do unless God was with him. Snuck in there by night because he was straddling the fence. He didn't want to step out and say, I'm a follower of Jesus, because he saw what happened when the blind man was healed in John chapter 9. Well, he's going to see what happened because it's going to happen later. But he's seen other events like this where the blind man was healed. And the blind man's parents should be grateful, should just be, overflowing with gratitude. Oh, Lord, thank you so much for healing my son. But they didn't even want to admit that Jesus had done it, because their friends had said, you believe in him, we're kicking you out of the synagogue. So right on the middle of that fence do they sit. They want the blessings that come from the healing, but they don't want to admit that he did it. They don't want the pressure that comes from that. Do we want the pressure that comes from really dedicating ourselves to Christianity? Do want to do the right thing. Do it when we're supposed to do it. Do it on time. Do it when it's difficult to do. Do it when it's easy to do. The Apostle Paul made the statement. He said, now we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength, and not just to please ourselves. I'm telling you, it's easy to help some people. Not so easy to help others. It's easy to help somebody when you really, really like them. It's easy to help somebody when it's pleasant for you to do it, when you get smiles and pats on the back. It's easy to do the right thing when everybody is praising you for it. But what about doing the right thing when you're going to pay the price for it? When it's going to cost you? When it's going to be something that you're going to sit back and you're going to say, whoa, why did I ever do that? Well, here's Saul of Tarsus. This man is the one that this Sanhedrin chooses to go be the official witness. Here's what they had to do. Anytime they had an execution, a stoning. Someone had to go from the Sanhedrin, for the Sanhedrin, and be that official witness. They had to make sure that everything was done by the book. By the book. So whenever someone stoned Paul, they had to use the witness that heard them say or saw them do, and that person had to be the one to pick up the first stone and throw it. And they had to lay their garments at the feet of the official witness. So Saul was that official witness. He was this up-and-coming rising star that everybody in the Sanhedrin knew was going to be their boy from here on out. So Saul was there watching this, heartily approving of the stoning and the killing of Stephen, this first Christian martyr. And right after that, it says, as Saul, still breathing threats and slaughter against the church, began this persecution that just began driving Christians all over the world. In Revelation, in chapter 12, it talks about the woman who was clothed with the sun and the moon and stars on her crown, that this woman was run out into the wilderness where she was nourished by God for 1,260 days. Well, that's the church. And the church was spread by this persecution that was begun by this man who was totally opposite of God's will. But what God saw in this man was not the fact that he was against him, but was the fact that this man, when he decides what he's going to do, he does it. And it doesn't matter what the cost. Saul begins this torturous campaign of destruction until he's on his way to Damascus with letters from this bunch of cowards that won't get off of their seat, that are straddling, some of them straddling the fence. He gets this letter from them and he goes to Damascus so he can find these people and he can persecute them, prosecute them, kill them, put them in prison, take their property away. When you read in the book of Hebrews in chapter 10 where it talks about many of them had seizure of their property and were put in prison, that's what it's talking about. That's what Saul was doing. He was putting these people in prison and confiscating their property, and the Sanhedrin was getting rich for it. Their boy, Saul, was the force behind it. But what they didn't understand about Saul was the fact that as much as he was on their side then, when the Lord appeared to him and it changed his mind, he was going to be just that much on this side of the fence. Never straddling the fence. Never straddling the fence. So when the Lord appeared to Saul, and he said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? He knew whoever that was greater than he was. He just didn't know who it was. Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, the Nazarene, whom you're persecuting. Get up and go into town, and I'll tell you what you need to do. How would you like to be the messenger that had to take that man the message? So the Lord calls Ananias and tells Ananias to go see this man. Ananias is straight on the middle of that fence. Lord, have you heard what... Can you imagine that? Have you heard what he has done? He's saying this to the Lord. Have you heard what he's done? Yes, go. Get out. Go do what I'm telling you to do. So he goes and he tells Saul. Now Saul, by the time he's struck to the ground by that powerful light, by the time he hears the voice of the Lord, saying, why are you persecuting me? And then he finds out who that is. From that moment on, he has hopped the fence and he's over here. No straddling for this man. He was this, now he's this, and he's going to remain that. There is a caveat though. This same man that was over here, that jumped over here, he has some problems that he's got to deal with. The Lord sees not only this man of strength, he also sees the tendency to be arrogant. He sees the tendency to not be as humble as he ought to be. He sees a tendency that this man could wind up exalting himself. So he gives him something to humble him. You ever been humbled? You ever had something happen to you that takes your legs right out from under you? Something that makes you realize that you're not God, you're a servant of God, and you better remember it. I must have been arrogant. I've had a few things to humble. A few things happen to make you think, whoa, Lord, did I cause that? Did I do that? Is that because of me? You know, if you don't think that, if you don't look inward when something happens to you, if you don't stop and ask yourself, is this because of my attitude that these things are happening to me? All those things are of no value. They have value. They have value to knock us off the fence and to make us realize that we're not God. We're servants of God. Right. And we best remember it. So Saul, first thing that happens to him, he's doing his job as a gospel preacher. Man, he and Barnabas healed a lame man. And boy, they jump out of the bushes wanting to make him a god, wanting to build an altar to him. And Paul says, you know, it kind of had to kind of be insulting because there were two gods. There was Zeus and Hermes. And the greatest of those, of course, is Zeus if you're a pagan, because that's the big guy, Zeus. And Hermes, you ever seen the, what is the messenger that takes flowers? Has the hat with wings on it and the Mercury, the wings on the feet. That's Mercury or Hermes, Greek or Roman name, but he's a messenger. He's not really a god. He's a messenger of the gods. And Barnabas says Barnabas is just standing there and seems to be the boss because Paul's doing all the talking and all the work. They call Barnabas Zeus, which must have, if you have an ego, that might, why is he Zeus? Why am I not Zeus? I don't know, but since Paul has this tendency to exalt himself, but you know, Paul didn't take that. He said, no, we're men just like you are. But you know, the more you get that kind of statement, the more you might stop and think, well, I am pretty special myself. Yes, I am. Well, the Lord is going to stop that, nip that in the bud. So right there in Lystra, Paul was captured by the Jews, came down and started making trouble, and he was dragged out of town and they stoned him. And I think they probably killed him. I think. It says he was left for dead. Well, I don't know if that means he died there or they just thought he was dead, but when you stop and think about what happened, Paul later on in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 says, I know a man 14 years ago, and that fits right with the time frame, who 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise. He went to heaven. went to heaven and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. And then he came back. He came back. That's the only recorded case I know of in history that a man died, went to heaven, and came back with the memory of it. I don't know. You know of any other case like that? I've never read of anybody else that happened to. But then there were consequences for that. He was given a thorn in the flesh, something to buffet his body daily, something that reminded him every day of his humanity. The fact that he was a servant of God. He wasn't above everybody else. He was a servant of God. One thing for sure, this man was not on the fence. He spent the rest of his life demonstrating to God's people how God's people ought to behave. Get off the fence. Establish yourself as what you ought to be. Is what Paul was teaching. It's the lesson he left for me. I keep getting reminded that I need to be decisive. We all do. Let's learn the right thing, decide the right thing, and do the right thing. It's our duty as Christians to not straddle that fence. If you have needs that you need to have met, if you know that your life's not right with God, would you use this day, this opportunity, to make your life right? Come to God. Have your sins forgiven. Won't you come while we stand and sing the song we have?